Welcome to the Cubao Church of Christ Sunday School for those who cannot make it to church today. Sunday school is always an exciting adventure. Our Sunday school is a gift from God. Let's now feast on His Word. Of all the things the Lord Jesus said and taught, He reserved His most condemning language for the unjust religious leaders. Ordinarily, He was gentle and kind even to the worst of sinners. However, the self-centered hypocrisy, the cruel, critical attitude and opposition of the religious leaders brought out Jesus' most severe comments on their actions and the eventual judgment for their sin. Today we will understand why He did this and how we can avoid following the error of the scribes and Pharisees He addressed. About a week before the Passover and His crucifixion, Jesus and His disciples left Jericho for His final visit to Jerusalem. Jesus met two blind men who asked Him to have mercy on them, and He gave them their sight. They stopped in Bethphage, where Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey to the praise of the people. Once in the city, Jesus went into the temple and found people buying and selling there. Angry, He drove them out, declaring that His Father's house was a house of prayer, but they had made it a den of thieves. The next morning, when He returned into the city, being hungry, He cursed a fig tree that had no fruits on it. Then Jesus gave the parable of the two sons, the parable of the householder and the parable of the marriage feast. Following this, the Pharisees joined with the others opposing Him to devise a way to trap Him. At this point, it was clear that Jesus' time on earth was coming to a close. Now for additional issues. The seat of Moses is a symbolic, physical seat within ancient synagogues where the scribes or Pharisees would sit during services. The phrase is found only in Matthew 23:2. This is the seat of authority in Pharisaical Judaism. It is beautiful, and located in a prominent position within the synagogue. That's why it is the most sought-after seat in the synagogue. The chair of Moses is a teaching position in the local synagogue. When a scribe or Pharisee sat in Moses' seat and spoke, it was received as the final word. It is as if a king sat upon his throne for official decrees. During those days it was an esteemed position and also an exploited position. A parallel today would be when the Pope sits in Peter's chair in the Vatican. As his seat of authority, the Pope makes pronouncements ex cathedra, meaning that these pronouncements are infallible and to be taken by all church members as gospel, no questions asked. Today Jesus deals with a bunch of hypocrite, a person who covers his real self with a mask, while he plays a part for his audience. Masks are worn to disguise who we really are. It can be done for fun. Or it can be done for harm. How we love them during Halloween, fiestas, special occasions, and avoid them when the person behind the mask intends to fool or hurt us. Often we wear masks to hide who we really are from others and from God. However, God can see through our mask. The Pharisees of Jesus' day were guilty of wearing masks. So are some of us in our societies. Some of us have become pretty good at multi-masking. Jesus provides a bit of hyperbole in today's lesson. He wants us to imagine someone who is about to take a drink of water from a cup. The person notices that there's a small bug in it. He strains the bug out. Then drinks the water, never noticing that there is a camel floating in the cup. The reference here is to the ancient custom of filtering wine. The bug or fly and the camel are in striking contrast to each other in size. The use of the camel here was obviously a hyperbole, but was appropriate, not only because of its great size, but because to the Jews the camel was an unclean animal. The Pharisees were careful to strain out the smallest creature, but swallowed the larger one. They were scrupulous about small things, but very careless about the more important matters. A similar idiom would be penny wise and pound foolish. Someone who is penny wise is someone who is very careful about how they spend small amounts of money. Are they also called Ilocanos? Yes, sometimes, because Ilocanos always think twice before dipping into their pockets. Someone who is pound foolish is someone who throws about large amounts of money indiscriminately. So someone who is both penny wise and pound foolish is straining a bug, focusing on small things, while swallowing a camel, ignoring larger things. We now proceed to the lesson. We will discuss two main divisions, namely Jesus' warnings and woes to the Pharisees who are hypocrites. Our first verse says, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples." After focusing his attention on the Pharisees, Jesus now directs his words to the crowds and to his disciples. Jesus turned to speak directly to the crowd to correct their mistaken ideas concerning the scribes and Pharisees. The people held these leaders in high esteem because of the positions they held as Israel's religious and political leaders. Jesus was about to set the record straight and reveal their true colors. This verse continues with, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat." Jesus accepted the scribes and the Pharisees as teachers of the law when he acknowledged that they sit in Moses' seat. This means that, like Moses, they held the position as public teachers and interpreters of the law. Since the law of Moses was the municipal law of Israel, they also acted as judges as much as the Romans would allow. Although Jesus accepted the position the scribes and the Pharisees held, he didn't accept what they taught or how they acted in their positions. These men were full of pride, Luke 18:10-14, tyrannical, and they hid their true selves under the pretense of religion. As far as appearances went, they observed the law, but their hearts were far from God, Matthew 15:1-8. Verse 3 continues, "So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach." Since the scribes and Pharisees taught the law of Moses, which was God's law and was to be obeyed by Israel, Jesus exhorted the people saying, "Be careful to do everything they tell you." We should not take this to mean that the people were to accept and abide by any teachings from the scribes and Pharisees. This was not a blanket command from Jesus. Whether the people did everything these leaders instructed depended on whether these leaders taught the truth of God's word. In other words, Jesus was saying, do everything they teach you because they sit in Moses' seat, meaning as long as these leaders read and teach the law as given to Moses by God. In verse 4 Jesus says they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. The Pharisees were often guilty of not following the law or the traditions that they considered to be as binding as the law, Matthew 15:3-6. The Pharisees loaded the people with impossible demands that they themselves didn't even try to keep. They were very severe in imposing upon others those things which they were not willing to submit to themselves. These laws and traditions were so burdensome that the Apostle James later referred to them as a yoke, Acts 15:1-10. Jesus then added they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. They would not do themselves the things that they imposed on others. They pressed upon the people a strictness in religion which they themselves were not bound by. They would not lift a finger to ease the people in these things, even when they saw what they taught was hard for the people to obey. As we jump to verse 23, Jesus begins his scathing remarks against the scribes and Pharisees saying, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites." The term woe is an exclamation of grief. Here Jesus uses it to express strong condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees. The Lord then calls them hypocrites. This word described a stage actor who wore a mask while portraying a role in a play. Jesus earlier warned his followers not to be like them, pretending to be something they are not, Matthew 5:20. Jesus then gives the reason for pronouncing this particular condemnation upon these religious leaders. He said, "You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. But you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Since the Pharisees believed in strictly adhering to the law, whether they obeyed it or not, they taught that a tithe should be given on everything, even tiny green garden spices like mint and dill and cumin. Attempting to adhere to Deuteronomy 14:22-23, the rabbis of Jesus' day included these spices as part of their tithe of grain. Jesus didn't condemn the scribes and Pharisees for tithing on these tiny spices. His point was that while doing this, they neglected the more important moral and spiritual provisions of the law, which are justice and mercy and faithfulness. Then Jesus said these ought yet to have done, and not to leave the other undone. In other words, judgment, mercy, and faith are the primary things that they ought to have done without neglecting to tithe. Jesus had called the scribes and Pharisees blind guides earlier, Matthew 23:16, because of their corrupt teaching. Here in verse 24 he calls them blind guides because of their corrupt living. Jesus was saying that the scribes and Pharisees were spiritually blind leaders, who strain at a fly, meaning they were more concerned about minor violations of God's law and their traditions. But on the other hand, Jesus said they would easily swallow a camel, meaning they ignored and violated God's precepts. In essence, Jesus was saying you condemn people for small mistakes, but you yourselves commit the biggest sin. They picked out the smallest and least commandments to focus on, and take pride in doing those, while completely ignoring the most important matters like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The scribes and Pharisees were more concerned about a person's outward conduct and religious rituals, things that could be seen by men, than they were with inner purity or cleansing and approval by God. So Jesus again pronounces, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Then he gave the reason why he calls them hypocrites again. He said it was because you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Again Jesus reveals the hypocrisy of the Pharisees by referring to their concern for cleanliness. The scribes and Pharisees concerned themselves with looking righteous to others and being praised for their righteousness, while in their hearts they were not right with God at all. Jesus said that they were careful to wash the cup and plate on the outside to illustrate that they wanted to appear pure before men, but inwardly they were dirty, being full of extortion and excess. In other words, whatever they used to fill the inside of their cups and plates was gotten by extortion or cheating others, and excess or pleasing themselves. Our final verse says, "Blind Pharisee. First clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean." Here, Jesus continues his statement from the previous verse. Now he refers to the objects of his condemnation as blind Pharisee. These religious leaders considered themselves to be the seers of the land, but Christ calls them what they really were, blind, John 9:39-41. According to Jesus, those are blind, who don't see the wickedness of their own hearts, who don't see and don't hate the secret sin that dwells there. Self-ignorance is the most shameful and hurtful ignorance, Revelation 3:17. After addressing the Pharisees, Jesus tells them how to remove their hypocrisy about purity and cleanliness. He said, "First clean the inside of the cup and dish." Notice that the Lord said to cleanse first the inside or the inner person, and when we do, automatically the outside of them may be clean also. External motives may give the appearance of purity on the outside while the inside remains filthy. But if renewing will make us clean on the inside, it will have an influence upon the outside, Romans 12:2, Ephesians 4:23-24. If the heart is well kept with all diligence, all is well, because out of it are the issues of life, Proverbs 4:23, Matthew 5:8. If the heart and spirit are made new, Psalms 51:10, there will be a newness of life, Romans 7:5-6. Therefore, to avoid hypocrisy, we must begin with ourselves and first cleanse that which is within, Psalms 24:3-5. Living our Christianity simply as a show for others is like washing only the outside of a cup while leaving the inside filthy. When we are clean on the inside, our cleanliness on the outside won't be a sham. Our key verse establishes that Jesus knows and encourages his listeners not to allow the hypocrisy of the teachers of the law and Pharisees to diminish their respect for the authority of the law. The law is still from Moses, and ultimately from God, in spite of how the teachers of the law and Pharisees have failed to live it out. What can we learn from hypocrites? A lot. Provided we take to heart Jesus' denunciation of the scribes and Pharisees. Do not imitate their abuse of authority, failure in teaching, and inconsistency of practice. Concentrate on God's law. Have healthy heart habits. Speaking of hypocrites, some people avoid church because there are too many hypocrites there. There may be hypocrites in the church, but that is no reason not to follow Jesus. Did the hypocrisy of Judas Iscariot permit the rest of the apostles to leave Jesus? Do you allow the presence of hypocrites keep you from enjoying church activities, such as sports events, potlucks, strengthening fellowship meetings, etc.? Besides, Which is better, to spend a short time with hypocrites in the church, or to spend eternity with hypocrites in hell? Remember what Jesus said of the hypocrites. As we close today's lesson, let us truly entrust our hearts to Christ, the great physician. He alone can keep your heart healthy. Our lesson next week is about the widow and the unjust judge. Biblical reference is Luke 18:1-8. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this week's lesson with us. We wish you can join us at the Cubao Church of Christ soon. Our congregation is a place to discover faith, find new friends, grow closer relationship with Christ, and serve with each other's gifts. Thank you very much, and God bless you always.